His tailored suit and confident stride weren't enough. For the officers cornering him, he was just a black man where he didn't belong. They were about to make the biggest mistake of their careers. Special Agent in Charge Elias Vance, 40 years old and carved from a career of relentless precision, moved through the gleaming lobby of the Apex Center in Charlotte with the practiced ease of a man who owned any space he occupied. The late afternoon sun of a North Carolina autumn slanted through the towering glass walls, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished black granite floors. To any casual observer, he was just another high-powered executive, his charcoal wool suit tailored to perfection, a discreet but substantial chronometer on his wrist marking the time with silent authority. But Elias's focus wasn't on the aesthetics. It was on the architecture of power and deceit housed within these walls. The Apex Center was the gleaming heart of Charlotte's financial district, and within it, 3 of its most prestigious tenants were the targets of his 18-month-long investigation. At the center of this web was Julian Mercer, a man who projected old money respectability while orchestrating a new money fraud of staggering proportions. Elias's mission tonight was simple, a final, covert reconnaissance before the full force of the FBI descended at dawn. He needed to see the battlefield with his own eyes, to feel its rhythms, to identify the vulnerabilities that no blueprint could reveal. His gaze swept the lobby, cataloging every detail with the detached expertise of a master strategist. He noted the placement of the security cameras, the blind spots near the elevator banks, the predictable patrol route of the loan guard at the main desk. Each observation was a piece of a puzzle, a variable in the complex equation of the coming raid. He adjusted the almost invisible earpiece that connected him to his team, stationed in unmarked vehicles around the building's perimeter. Phase 1 initiated, he murmured, his voice a low, steady hum. "Eyes on, ears open. I'm moving to the upper floors." As he stepped into the elevator, the reflection in the polished steel doors showed a man at the peak of his professional life. 15 years in the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division had honed his instincts to a razor's edge. He dismantled criminal enterprises from Miami to Manhattan, always operating with a blend of meticulous planning and quiet audacity. Yet, alongside his professional accolades, another, more private file existed, a file born of necessity and quiet fury. He thought back to the conversation with Director Croft just 3 months prior, in the sterile quiet of FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. On the screen between them played surveillance footage from a different city, showing another black agent, Undercover, being forced to the ground by local police. "That's the 5th incident this quarter, Elias," Croft had said, his voice tight with a frustration that mirrored Elias's own. "We're losing operational integrity because our agents of color can't conduct basic reconnaissance without being profiled." Elias had leaned forward, his hands clasped on the polished table. "Then we stopped treating them as isolated incidents. We need a protocol, a way to document these encounters systematically, without compromising the primary mission." That conversation had given birth to this secondary protocol, a classified FBI initiative championed by Elias himself. It was a strategy of dual documentation. When confronted by biased law enforcement, agents were authorized to withhold their federal credentials, to endure the encounter as a civilian would, and to meticulously record every detail. It was a dangerous gambit, transforming a moment of personal risk into an opportunity for systemic evidence gathering. The protocol was a shield forged from their own vulnerability. As the elevator ascended, Elias pushed the memory aside, his focus returning to the immediate task. The doors opened onto the 14th floor, the executive level, where Julian Mercer's primary company, Mercer Holdings, occupied the entire space. The air here was different, hushed, rarefied, smelling of expensive leather and corporate ambition. He began his slow, methodical walk, his footsteps silenced by the plush carpeting. He made quiet voice notes on his encrypted phone, detailing security keypad models, the location of private server rooms, the subtle indentations in the carpet suggesting the placement of heavy safes. Every detail was crucial for the morning's operation. He was a hunter, mapping the terrain, unaware that in a darkened room miles away, another hunter was watching him, driven by a far different and far more primitive set of instincts. In the Central Security office, a sterile, windowless room located in the basement of the Apex Center, Carl Miller leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowed into slits. A lukewarm cup of coffee sat forgotten beside his keyboard. For 20 years, Carl had worked in private security, a career path he'd settled for after failing the police academy entrance exam twice. That failure had curdled into a quiet resentment, which he masked with an exaggerated sense of vigilance. He saw himself as the building's true guardian, the unsung hero protecting this temple of commerce from the threats the executives upstairs were too naive to recognize. And tonight, his instincts were screaming. On screen, the man in the expensive suit moved with a purpose that Carl found deeply unsettling. He wasn't just wandering. He was observing, cataloging. He paused by the door to the executive suite, his head tilted as if listening. He took out his phone, not to make a call, but to speak into it in low, clipped tones. He ran a hand along the frame of a window overlooking the city, testing its lock. To Elias, these were the actions of a professional agent. To Carl Miller, they were the unmistakable hallmarks of a high-class thief casing a joint. "Look at this guy," Carl muttered to his younger, less engaged colleague, who was busy scrolling through social media on his phone, prowling the 14th floor like he owns the place. "Who does he think he is?" The colleague glanced up, shrugged, and went back to his phone. "Probably just some hotshot lawyer working late." "No," Carl insisted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Lawyers are loud. They talk on the phone. They leave a mess. This guy, he's quiet. Too quiet. He moves like a shadow. I've been doing this for 20 years. You develop a sense for these things. He doesn't belong here." The phrase hung in the air, solidifying Carl's suspicion into certainty. He doesn't belong here. It wasn't just about the man's actions. It was about something more fundamental in Carl's worldview. The man was black, and in Carl's experience, black men in tailored suits in this building after hours were an anomaly, and anomalies were threats until proven otherwise. Every tick of the clock, every methodical step the man on the screen took, reinforced Carl's narrative. He saw the man pause to examine a security camera, and in his mind, it wasn't an assessment of its model, but a plan to disable it. He saw him take notes, and it wasn't reconnaissance, but a criminal's blueprint. He rewound the footage from the lobby, watching again as the man entered. He saw the confident stride, the expensive watch, the way he surveyed the space. To a neutral observer, it was a display of authority. To Carl, it was an elaborate act, a costume designed to deceive. The confidence was arrogance, the suit, a disguise. "That's it," Carl said, his decision made. He reached for the dedicated phone that connected directly to the local police precinct, bypassing the standard 911 dispatch. He had a personal relationship with a few of the night shift sergeants, a rapport built on years of providing them with coffee and a sense of shared purpose. He punched in a number, his eyes still glued to the monitor, where Elias was now examining the emergency exit stairwell. "Yeah, Russo? It's Carl Miller down at the Apex Center. Got a situation here." He listened for a moment, then continued, his voice a low, urgent baritone. "Got a 10 to 36, a suspicious person. 14th floor, executive suites. Male, black, about 6 feet, athletic build. Wearing a suit that's probably worth more than my car, but he's acting real strange. Taking pictures of security features, casing the joint. Looks like he's prepping for a B&E. He paused, letting the implications sink in. No sign of forced entry. He walked in the front door, bold as brass. "That's what's got me on edge. He's trying to blend in, but I'm not buying it. This guy's a pro." He deliberately omitted the fact that Elias had done nothing overtly illegal. He didn't mention that the building was still technically open or that the man hadn't tried to force any locks. Instead, he painted a picture with the colors of his own prejudice, crafting a narrative of imminent danger that required an immediate, forceful response. He was transforming Elias Vance, FBI special agent, into a phantom menace, a threat born from his own biased imagination. "Yeah, he's still up there," Carl concluded, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "You guys better get here quick, before he finds what he's looking for." He hung up the phone, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his arms. The trap was set. Now he just had to watch. The air on the 14th floor was still and cool, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the building's climate control system. Elias had just finished his assessment of the floor's server room access points and was making his final notes. Minimal after-hours presence. Primary data storage vulnerable to direct access. Recommend 2-agent secure team for this location. He was so immersed in the tactical calculus of the raid that he didn't hear the soft chime of the elevator arriving. He only registered the threat when the voices cut through the silence. "Police! Freeze! Hands where I can see them." The command was sharp, aggressive, and absolute. Elias's training took over in a nanosecond. He didn't flinch. He didn't make any sudden moves. He slowly straightened up from his crouch position, turning to face the source of the command. His hands rose automatically to chest level, palms forward, fingers spread. A universal sign of non-aggression. 3 officers stood before him, fanned out in a classic tactical formation. They had emerged from the elevator and moved with a speed and silence that spoke of experience. The lead officer, a man in his mid-40s with a thick neck and a crew cut that seemed to accentuate the hard set of his jaw, had his hand resting on the grip of his holstered sidearm. This was Officer Russo. His eyes, cold and devoid of curiosity, had already tried and convicted Elias. The other 2 officers flanked him, effectively cutting off any path of retreat. Elias's mind worked with crystalline clarity, processing dozens of variables at once. The officers' stances, the tension in their shoulders, the way Russo's thumb was already unsnapping the retention strap on his holster. He saw not just 3 cops, but a tactical problem with potentially fatal consequences. "Good evening, officers," Elias said, his voice perfectly modulated, calm, respectful, but firm. "Is there a problem?" Russo took a step forward, his boots making a soft, menacing sound on the plush carpet. "That's what we're here to find out. We got a call about a suspicious individual on a restricted floor." He gestured vaguely around the opulent hallway. "What's your business here?" This was the critical moment, the inflection point. Elias could end the entire confrontation in 5 seconds. He could reach into his jacket, produce the gold shield and credentials that identified him as a special agent in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and watch the aggression meld away into fumbling apologies. The thought was tempting. It was the easy way out. But as he looked into Russo's eyes, he saw more than just a cop doing his job. He saw the same premature judgment, the same unquestioning acceptance of a biased narrative that he had seen in the footage in Director Croft's office. He saw the spark of the systemic problem he had vowed to fight, and he made his choice. He would not take the easy way out. He would activate the secondary protocol. "I'm conducting a property assessment," Elias replied, his answer deliberately vague. He kept his hands raised, his posture non-threatening. Just then, the elevator doors opened again, and Carl Miller stepped out, a look of vindicated importance on his face. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias. "That's him. That's the guy. I told you, Russo. Been up here for almost half an hour, snooping around." Russo's focus intensified. "ID," he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. It wasn't a request. It was an order. "And do it slowly." "Of course," Elias said. "I'm going to reach into the inside pocket of my jacket. My wallet is there." He moved with painstaking slowness, narrating his every action. His fingers brushed against the cool leather of the wallet and, next to it, the hard, familiar shape of his badge holder. He consciously bypassed the badge, pulling out only the wallet. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Revealing his status now would compromise the entire 18-month investigation into Julia Mercer. The targets would be alerted, evidence would be destroyed, and a massive criminal enterprise would scatter to the winds. The cost was too high. The secondary protocol was not just an option. It was a necessity. He carefully extracted his driver's license and handed it to Russo. He made sure that his federal law enforcement credentials, tucked neatly behind the license, were momentarily visible. It was a test, a chance for Russo to demonstrate due diligence. Russo took the license, his eyes flicking over it. Elias saw the briefest flicker of recognition as he glimpsed the other credentials, but he deliberately ignored them. He focused solely on the driver's license, a small piece of plastic that identified Elias not as a federal agent, but as a black man with a residential address. Mr. Elias Vance, Russo said, drawing out the name with a theatrical slowness, as if it were an alias. He looked up from the license, his gaze filled with undisguised suspicion. Care to explain what kind of property assessment involves photographing security cameras and mapping out exit routes? Carl Miller, emboldened by the police presence, stepped forward, puffing out his chest. I've never seen him before. He's not on any of our approved vendor lists. He doesn't have clearance for the executive floors. I'm authorized to be here, Elias stated, his voice unwavering. He met Russo's gaze directly, a silent battle of wills playing out in the hushed corridor. The air was thick with tension, the unspoken accusation of race hanging heavier than any spoken word. Elias knew this was no longer a simple misunderstanding. It was a deliberate escalation, and he was now fully committed to seeing it through to its conclusion, not as an FBI agent, but as the man they saw before them, a suspect. The descent in the elevator was a study in controlled hostility. Elias stood in the center, flanked by two officers, while Russo and Carl Miller stood before him, a pair of self-appointed guardians. The polished steel walls reflected their tense tableau, for white men in positions of authority, escorting one black man who, by their judgment, had trespassed into their world. We need to secure the premises, Miller announced loudly to no one in particular as they reached the ground floor. Can't be too careful these days. This is what vigilance looks like. The lobby, which had been quiet upon Elias's arrival, now held a small but growing audience. A handful of late-working professionals, analysts, junior partners, administrative staff, overwhelmingly white, were gathering their belongings, their conversations tapering off as they witnessed the scene unfolding. Heads turned, eyes widened. The sight of a well-dressed black man being escorted by 3 police officers was an irresistible piece of corporate theater. Elias felt the shift instantly. The air grew thick with whispers and unspoken questions. He saw smartphones emerge from pockets and purses, their small lenses glinting in the bright lobby lights. They were recording. Good. Evidence gathering works both ways. He kept his expression impassive, a mask of neutrality, but subtly shifted his posture to ensure his face was clearly visible in their footage. He would not be an anonymous suspect in this drama. Stand here, Russo ordered, directing Elias to a spot directly under a large, modern chandelier, a location that offered maximum visibility to the onlookers. It was a deliberate act of staging, designed to amplify the humiliation. Empty your pockets. Everything on the security desk. Now. Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Officer, he began, his voice level but carrying clearly to the growing crowd. Is this standard procedure for someone who has not been charged with a crime, has not resisted, and has provided identification? The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Russo's authority. Several onlookers exchanged uneasy glances. I give the orders here, Mr. Vance. Russo snapped, his face flushing with anger. Just do it. With methodical precision, Elias began to empty his pockets. He moved with a deliberate slowness that was in itself a form of defiance. Each item was placed carefully on the polished granite of the security desk. First, the wallet, then his car keys, his encrypted phone, finally, the small, leather-bound notebook he used for field observations. Russo snatched the notebook as if it were a smoking gun. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting. Well, what do we have here? He announced, holding the notebook up for the crowd to see, like a trophy. Floor plans, security camera locations, notes on access points. Looks like a criminal's playbook to me. Those are professional observations. Officer, Elias responded calmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. There is nothing illegal about noting the features of a building. Carl Miller seized the moment, puffing up his chest and addressing the onlookers as if he were the hero of the hour. "This is what happens when we stay vigilant. People," he declared, his voice ringing with self-importance. "This is how we keep this building and our tenants safe." He shot a pointed glance at Elias, making the subtext unmistakably clear: "From people like you." Elias's gaze drifted over the crowd. He saw a spectrum of reactions: fear, morbid curiosity, a few glimmers of sympathy. He locked eyes for a moment with two black women standing near the entrance, their faces a familiar mixture of weary recognition and quiet anger. They had seen this play before. Perhaps they had even starred in it. Their shared look was a silent acknowledgement of a burden they all carried. "Are we finished?" Elias asked, his voice sharp with controlled impatience, after Russo had finished his theatrical examination of each item. "Or would you like to continue this public spectacle for your audience?" "Don't get smart with me," Russo warned, shoving Elias's belongings back across the counter with a deliberate roughness. The notebook skittered across the granite and fell to the floor. Elias bent to retrieve it, his movements fluid and dignified, refusing to let them see the fury that was coiling in his gut. "We're escorting you out," Russo said, his voice low and menacing. "And don't come back to this building without proper authorization." Outside, under the cold, indifferent gaze of the night security cameras, the pretense of professionalism dissolved completely. With no audience to perform for, Russo's raw prejudice surfaced. He got unnecessarily close to Elias, invading his personal space. "Let me make something crystal clear," he hissed. "You'd be a lot smarter not to show your face around here again. Understand?" Elias stood his ground, unintimidated. "Is that a threat, Officer Russo?" he asked quietly. "Or are you officially banning me from a public building based on my race, rather than on any illegal action?" Russo's face hardened into a mask of pure animosity. "I'm warning you about trespassing charges. Next time, it won't be a friendly conversation like this one." Elias committed every detail of the encounter to his eidetic memory. The exact phrasing of the veiled threat, Russo's aggressive posture, Miller's performative security theater, the faces in the crowd. His FBI training and evidence collection was now serving a purpose its instructors had never intended. As the patrol car finally pulled away, leaving him standing on the curb, Elias felt not defeat, but the cold, hard certainty of a plan set in motion. They had just handed him all the evidence he would ever need. The moment the patrol car's taillights disappeared around the corner, Elias's phone vibrated in his hand. The screen glowed with a secure, encrypted call. The caller ID read, "Director Croft." Elias stepped back into the shadows of the building's massive stone columns, turning away from the street. He answered on the second ring. "It happened again, sir," he said, his voice a low, controlled monotone that betrayed none of the humiliation he had just endured. "Details." Director Croft's voice came back, sharp and immediate. There was no preamble, no wasted words. With the precision of a trained observer dictating a formal report, Elias recounted the entire confrontation. He detailed Carl Miller's initial call, built on baseless suspicion. He described Officer Russo's deliberate escalation, the refusal to acknowledge his credentials, and the public shaming stage for maximum effect in the lobby. He quoted Russo's final, thinly veiled threat verbatim. His tone remained professional, but the tightly coiled anger beneath the surface was unmistakable to a man who had known him for over a decade. There was a moment of silence on the line as Croft absorbed the information. "Your call, Elias," he said finally. "We can postpone the primary operation. Reassign the reconnaissance. We can handle this through official channels right now." "No." Elias's response was instant and absolute. The thought of backing down felt like a betrayal of the protocol's very purpose. "The financial investigation into Mercer proceeds exactly as planned, but I'm formally invoking the secondary protocol. I'm documenting this entire incident for a parallel investigation." "You're certain?" Croft pressed, not questioning his judgment, but ensuring he understood the stakes. "Revealing your status tomorrow, in the midst of the raid, will make the point far more effectively than a complaint filed tonight." "I'm certain," Elias confirmed, his gaze fixed on the gleaming facade of the Apex Center. They need to see both sides of the coin. They need to understand who they chose to humiliate. The impact needs to be direct, personal, and undeniable. Another pause, shorter this time. Understood, Croft said, his voice now carrying a note of grim resolve. You have the full and unequivocal support of this office. Document everything. We'll have the Civil Rights Division prepped and ready to move on your signal. Thank you, sir. Elias ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. He took one last look at the building, his mind already shifting gears, reformulating the next day's operation. This was no longer just a raid on a financial criminal. It was now a two-front war. He walked a few blocks to his hotel, the cool night air doing little to quell the fire in his chest. The hotel room was a sterile, anonymous space that he had transformed into a temporary command center. On one wall, he had pinned photographs of the primary targets. Julian Mercer and his top lieutenants, their confident, smiling faces belying the complex fraud they were running. Now he opened his laptop and, with a few keystrokes, accessed a secure law enforcement database. He pulled up the official photos of Carl Miller and Officer Russo. He printed them out and pinned them on the wall next to Julian Mercer's. 3 new targets. 3 men who had, in the space of an hour, become central figures in a major federal investigation they didn't even know existed. Elias opened a secure application on his laptop and began to dictate his formal report of the incident. He listed names, badge numbers, precise timestamps. He quoted dialogue with forensic accuracy. He described the witnesses in the lobby, the positioning of the officers, the make and model of the security cameras that had recorded the entire event. The report was automatically encrypted and routed to a specialized, compartmentalized server within the FBI's Civil Rights Division, a digital lockbox for incidents documented under the secondary protocol. Next, he placed a secure call to Agent Diaz, his second-in-command. "We need to adjust tomorrow's parameters," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "Building security and local police must now be considered potentially hostile factors." "They made you?" Diaz asked, concern in his voice. "Not exactly," Elias replied, a grim irony in his tone. "They made assumptions, and tomorrow we're going to use those assumptions against them." Meanwhile, miles away, in a dimly lit hotel bar, Carl Miller was nursing a whiskey, recounting a heroic, heavily embellished version of the night's events to a colleague. "Had to escort a real, suspicious character out of the building tonight," he said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Casing the 14th floor. You know the type. Trying to look like he fit in, but I wasn't fooled for a second. My instincts told me he was trouble." Back in his hotel room, Elias Vance ignored the lingering sting of humiliation. He was focused, his mind a cold engine of logic and strategy. The Apex Center investigation was about more than just the tens of millions in investor fraud. It was about the illusion of security, the facade of respectability that men like Mercer used to conceal their crimes. And men like Miller and Russo were the unwitting gatekeepers, so focused on policing the color of a man's skin that they failed to see the real predators operating right under their noses. He placed his FBI credentials on the nightstand, the gold shield catching the lamplight. He had deliberately withheld its power tonight. Tomorrow, he would unleash it. "Diaz," he said into the phone his final instructions for the night. "Tomorrow, we're not just conducting a raid. We're conducting 2. The first rays of dawn had just begun to slice through the Charlotte skyline when Elias Vance strode through the revolving doors of the Apex Center. The charcoal wool suit of the previous evening was gone, replaced by a navy blue tactical windbreaker with bold, 3-inch yellow letters spelling out FBI across the back and chest. There was no ambiguity today, no room for interpretation. He was a declaration in motion. Behind him, 12 agents flowed into the lobby in a display of synchronized, silent precision. They moved in a diamond formation, a living embodiment of federal authority. Each agent wore the same tactical gear. Each carried a sidearm holstered securely on their hip, and each wore a body camera, its single red light blinking with impartial vigilance. They didn't rush. Their pace was deliberate, measured, and utterly unstoppable. The soft scuff of their tactical boots on the polished granite was the only sound in the cavernous space. Elias wore his credentials openly now, clipped to his jacket, the golden shield gleaming like a small sun against the dark fabric. His expression was a mask of professional neutrality, but his posture had undergone a fundamental transformation. Yesterday, he had been a man trying to remain invisible. Today, he was the center of gravity in the room, a commander in his element, leading a major federal operation onto its target. In the basement security office, Carl Miller's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. He stared at the primary lobby monitor, his brain struggling to process the image. He saw the formation of agents, the bold FBI lettering, and then his eyes locked onto their leader. His face contorted through a rapid series of emotions: confusion, recognition, dawning comprehension, and finally, pure, unadulterated alarm. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. "No," he whispered, the coffee cup slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the console, splashing lukewarm liquid across the bank of monitors. "It can't be." He fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. He bypassed the precinct dispatch and dialed Officer Russo's direct cell number. His voice was a panicked squeak. "Russo, the guy from yesterday, the guy we threw out. He's back. He's got a whole team with him. They're wearing FBI jackets." Upstairs, Elias paid no mind to the security cameras he knew were now trained on him with frantic intensity. He approached the main security desk, where a different, younger guard sat wide-eyed, frozen in a mixture of awe and fear at the sudden federal presence. Special Agent in Charge Elias Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Elias announced, his voice calm and resonant, easily filling the large space. He didn't just present his credentials. He placed them on the counter with a definitive thud, alongside a thick folder of documents. "These are federal warrants authorizing our immediate and unrestricted access to the offices, servers, and records listed within. We require all master key cards and a complete list of your security protocols for the entire building." Now, just then, the door to the back office swung open and Carl Miller stumbled out, his face flushed, his uniform looking hastily thrown on. "Agent," he stammered, rushing forward. "Agent, I didn't realize yesterday. There seems to have been a terrible misunderstanding." Elias turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting Carl's. His eyes were cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of emotion. He looked at Carl not as a person, but as a piece of evidence. "Mr. Miller," he said, his voice flat. He slid a document across the counter toward the trembling security director, completely ignoring his attempted explanation. "We require your immediate compliance with this federal warrant. Any delay will be considered obstruction of justice." Carl picked up the warrant with a hand that trembled like a leaf in a storm. He stared at the official seal, the dense legal text, and the signature of a federal judge. His authority, which had seemed so absolute the night before, had evaporated into nothing. He backed away from the desk, his phone already pressed to his ear again, this time calling the one man he thought could protect him. "Mr. Mercer." "Sir, the FBI is here. They have warrants. And the man I had removed yesterday, he's leading them." Elias turned back to his team, his voice ringing with command. "Diaz, take your team to the 14th floor. Secure all offices of Mercer Holdings. Jackson, 15th floor, Alice Investment Partners. Williams, you have the server room in the sublevel. Go." The agents dispersed with silent efficiency, peeling off from the central formation and moving towards the elevators and stairwells. They moved with the confident purpose of a force that knew it could not be stopped. Carl Miller watched them go, a helpless, horrified spectator in his own security domain. The protocols he had so zealously enforced against Elias the night before were now rendered utterly meaningless, swept aside by the tide of federal authority that had just crashed through the lobby doors. The king had returned to his castle, and this time, everyone knew who was in charge. The lobby of the Apex Center had transformed from a tranquil corporate atrium into a federal staging ground. FBI agents moved with quiet, disciplined energy, their presence fundamentally altering the building's atmosphere. 7 minutes after the raid began, Officer Russo arrived, his patrol car screeching to a halt at the curb. He had clearly rushed from home, his uniform hastily assembled, a stray bit of shaving cream still visible on his jawline. He burst through the revolving doors, his expression a mixture of confusion and agitation, ready to confront what he assumed was a major security breach. He froze at the entrance. The scene before him was not one of chaos, but of chillingly efficient order. He saw the FBI windbreakers, the agents methodically entering offices, the evidence bags already being prepped. And then he saw him, standing in the center of it all, directing the operation with the calm authority of a field marshal, was the man he had threatened and humiliated less than 12 hours earlier. Elias Vance. Russo's mind stuttered. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The man he had dismissed as a trespassing criminal was now commanding a federal raid in the very building he had been ejected from. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. Elias saw Russo arrive. He paused his conversation with an agent, turned his head, and acknowledged the dumbstruck police officer with nothing more than a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture devoid of anger or triumph. It was worse. It was a gesture of dismissal, the kind a superior gives to an irrelevant subordinate. He then turned back to his coordination efforts, leaving Russo standing alone and utterly powerless near the entrance. Carl Miller, meanwhile, was hovering near the security desk like a ghost at his own funeral. He kept darting nervous, pleading glances at Elias, who continued to ignore him completely. His anxiety spiked to a new level as he watched the main elevator doors slide open, revealing a distinguished, silver-haired man in a suit even more expensive than the one Elias had worn. It was Julian Mercer, the CEO of Mercer Holdings, the king of the Apex Center. Mercer strode into the lobby with his usual air of untouchable authority, his face a mask of irritation at the disruption. "What in God's name is going on here?" he boomed, his voice accustomed to instant obedience. His eyes swept over the FBI agents with disdain, before finally landing on Elias, who was now walking calmly and deliberately to intercept him. Mercer stopped mid-stride. His authoritative entrance collapsed as he finally registered the full scope of the federal presence. His gaze darted from the agents, methodically securing his building to the calm, imposing black man now standing directly in his path. The man from a security report Carl had given him last night. "Mr. Mercer." Elias's tone was professionally detached, the voice of a surgeon about to make a deep incision. "I am Special Agent in Charge Elias Vance, FBI Financial Crimes Division." "Financial crimes?" Mercer scoffed, attempting to project outrage, but a flicker of fear betrayed him. "This is an outrage. An invasion. What is the meaning of this?" Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply extended the warrant, holding it for Mercer to see. "This federal warrant details the scope of our investigation into securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering operations being conducted within this building, specifically involving Mercer Holdings, Atlas Investment Partners, and Meridian Trust." Each company name was a hammer blow, striking at the foundations of Mercer's criminal empire. Carl Miller, seeing his employer and protector now under attack, edged closer, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Mercer," he stammered, desperate to deflect blame, "this is the individual I told you about. From the incident yesterday." Elias slowly turned his attention from Mercer to Miller, his eyes like chips of ice. "Yes, Mr. Miller. The incident," he said, the word dripping with irony. "Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that for Mr. Mercer. The one where you reported me as a suspicious person, based on what? Exactly? My appearance in a building I was authorized to be in?" Miller's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. Mercer, a master of self-preservation, immediately distanced himself. "I have no knowledge of any incident," he declared, his voice cold. "Mr. Miller acts independently on all security matters. It has nothing to do with me." "Interesting," Elias noted, his voice dangerously soft. And yet, phone records, which we have already subpoenaed, show that he placed a call directly to your personal cell phone at 7:43 p.m. last night, immediately after I was escorted from the premises. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Mercer's carefully constructed composure fractured for a split second before he recovered. Building security naturally alerts me to any and all concerns. It was a routine update. Officer Russo, seeing his own professional life circling the drain, finally stepped forward, trying to align himself with the legitimate authority in the room. "Sir, Agent Vance, we were simply responding to a suspicious person call from building security. It was standard procedure." "Of course, standard procedure," Elias acknowledged with a nod of calculated politeness. He let the words hang in the air for a beat, then delivered the killing blow. "Just as it is standard procedure for the Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate potential civil rights violations alongside financial crimes." The word violations landed with the physical weight of a body blow. It echoed in the sudden, dead silence of the lobby. Carl Miller went pale. Officer Russo's professional mask slipped, revealing the raw fear beneath. Julian Mercer finally seemed to understand that the firewalls he had built around his life were about to be breached, not by a financial inquiry he might beat in court, but by something far more personal and damning. The man they had humiliated was not just a Fed, he was the wrong Fed. The atmosphere in the lobby crackled, the air thick with unspoken fear and dawning horror. Elias Vance stood at the epicenter of the storm he had unleashed, a figure of absolute control. He was no longer just an investigator. He was the living embodiment of consequence. "Agent Diaz," Elias called out, his voice cutting through the tension. His second-in-command, a sharp, efficient Hispanic agent who was cataloging documents nearby, looked up. "Please work with Mr. Miller here to access the remaining secured areas in the building's central surveillance archives. We need all footage from the last 24 hours. Unedited." Diaz nodded and approached the security director. "Mr. Miller." Carl Miller hesitated, his discomfort at taking directions from a Hispanic agent palpable. It was another layer of bias, another data point that Elias silently logged. The patterns were everywhere. Julian Mercer, seeing his empire being dismantled before his eyes, tried to play his last card. "I have friends," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Powerful friends in Washington. They will be very, very interested to hear about this gross overreach of federal authority." "That statement, Mr. Mercer," Elias replied, his voice as even and cool as polished steel, "has just been recorded by at least 4 active body cameras, including my own. I would strongly advise against saying anything further that could be construed as attempting to obstruct a federal investigation." Mercer fell silent, his face a thunderous mask of fury and impotence. He finally understood the tactical disadvantage he was at. His influence, his connections, his wealth, all of it was rendered meaningless in the face of the federal authority being wielded by the very man he and his underlings had so casually dismissed. It was at that moment that a female police officer, one of the 2 junior partners who had been with Russo the night before, cautiously approached. She had been standing at the periphery, her face a portrait of growing unease. "Agent Vance?" she began, her voice tentative. "Sir, I was present during the encounter yesterday. I was not directly involved in the decision-making, but I would like to provide a formal statement about what I observed." Elias turned to her, and for the first time, the icy professionalism in his eyes warmed slightly. He gave her a nod of respect. "Thank you, officer. We appreciate your integrity. We will arrange for your formal testimony to be taken by an agent from our Civil Rights Division." His respectful tone was a stark contrast to the cold dismissal he had shown Russo, who watched the exchange with a look of utter betrayal and growing panic. The blue wall of silence was cracking right in front of him. As if on cue, Elias's secure phone rang again. He stepped aside to take the call, his back to the assembled group. He listened intently for a moment, his expression unreadable, before responding with a single, decisive word: "Approved." When he turned back, an additional layer of authority seemed to settle upon him. He addressed each of the three men who had wronged him, his voice deliberate and measured, ensuring each word landed with maximum impact. Mr. Mercer, Officer Russo, Mr. Miller. He paused, letting them absorb the gravity of his tone. We have just received authorization from the Department of Justice to officially expand the scope of our investigation. Expansion? Mercer's voice was tight with disbelief. The warrant you showed me specifically covers financial documentation. This is harassment. This is a separate matter, Elias clarified, his gaze unwavering. The FBI's Civil Rights Division, in conjunction with the U.S. Attorney's Office, has now authorized a concurrent and formal investigation into potential criminal violations of federal law stemming from the incident that occurred at this location at approximately 7:30 p.m. yesterday evening. He then turned his full attention to Carl Miller. Mr. Miller, we will require all security footage from this building for the past 6 months. In particular, we will be analyzing every suspicious person report you have filed in that time. I trust none of those recordings will be subject to any unfortunate malfunctions. Some of those cameras are on a loop, Miller stammered, his face ashen. Attempting to alter, delete, or otherwise destroy evidence in a federal investigation is a felony, Mr. Miller. Elias responded without a flicker of emotion. Agent Williams, a digital forensic specialist, will now proceed to the security office to secure your entire surveillance system to prevent any such malfunctions. You will grant him complete access. A young agent detached from a group and moved towards the security office. Miller watched him go, his shoulders slumping in utter defeat. Elias had saved the final, most devastating blow for last. He looked from Miller to Russo to Mercer, connecting the dots for them in a way that was both terrifying and irrefutable. To be absolutely clear, he said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. Your financial crimes, Mr. Mercer, and your security team's discriminatory practices, Mr. Miller, will now be treated as a single, interconnected investigation. The working theory, which the Department of Justice has just authorized us to pursue, is that a hostile and discriminatory security environment was deliberately fostered in this building to deflect and discourage legitimate scrutiny from the massive financial crimes being committed on the upper floors. It was a masterstroke. He had woven their separate transgressions, one of greed, one of prejudice, into a single, unified conspiracy. They were no longer just a crooked CEO, a racist security guard, and a bully cop. In the eyes of the federal government, they were now co-conspirators. They were all sinking on the same ship, and Elias Vance was the man who had just blown the hole in its hull. The consequences of that morning's raid descended not like a storm, but like a series of precisely targeted drone strikes, each one hitting its mark with devastating accuracy. The fallout was immediate, relentless, and broadcast across every news channel in the state. Day 1. The FBI's forensic accounting teams, unleashed by Elias's warrants, swarmed over Mercer Holdings. They moved through the corporate offices like a swarm of locusts, consuming data, seizing servers, and carting away boxes of documents. What they uncovered was even more audacious than Elias's initial investigation had suggested. The fraud wasn't just a simple Ponzi scheme. It was a labyrinth of shell corporations, falsified audits, and offshore accounts designed to launder money for organized crime syndicates. The initial estimate of the fraud ballooned from tens of millions to well over $100 million. The local news, initially reporting on a major FBI raid, quickly escalated its language to one of the largest financial crime busts in North Carolina history. Day 2. The Apex Center's ownership, a massive real estate investment trust based in New York, went into full panic mode. Carl Miller was formally suspended, pending investigation. The property management company issued a hastily written public statement, filled with corporate jargon about taking all allegations seriously and a commitment to a safe and inclusive environment. They immediately hired an outside law firm to conduct an internal review, a transparent attempt to get ahead of the federal investigation. The lobby of the Apex Center, where Elias had been humiliated, now featured a new, prominently displayed non-discrimination policy, a silent monument to the management's terror. Day 3. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, faced with the irrefutable evidence of the body cameras and the formal complaint from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, was forced to act. Officer Russo was placed on administrative leave. The department's Internal Affairs Division launched a formal investigation, and the female officer who had come forward to Elias was immediately placed under their protection as a key witness. Her testimony proved to be the linchpin, revealing that Russo's encounter with Elias was not an isolated incident, but part of a consistent pattern of behavior. The police chief, a man who prided himself on his department's community relations, found himself facing a firestorm of negative press and calls for his resignation. Day 5. The story went national. The dual nature of the investigation, a massive white-collar crime bust intertwined with a stark case of racial profiling against the lead federal agent, was a narrative too compelling for the national media to ignore. Elias's name and, more importantly, his photograph were everywhere. He was the stoic, professional face of the story, the embodiment of authority who had been wrongfully challenged based on the color of his skin. His refusal to give interviews only enhanced his mystique, making him seem even more formidable. Day 7. The first of the secondary victims emerged. Spurred by the news reports, 3 other black professionals, a doctor, a lawyer, and an architect, came forward with their own stories of being harassed, questioned, and humiliated by Carl Miller and his security team at the Apex Center. Their accounts, nearly identical to Elias's experience, transformed the narrative from a single incident into a documented pattern of systemic discrimination. The civil rights case against the building's management and their security contractor was now ironclad. Day 9. Julian Mercer, out on a multi-million-dollar bond, made his next critical mistake. He attempted to leverage his political connections, placing calls to a U.S. congressman and a former federal judge he had once counted as friends. But the FBI, anticipating this move, had already secured a warrant for wiretaps under the ongoing financial crimes investigation. The calls, in which Mercer tried to pressure his contacts to intervene, were meticulously recorded. When confronted with the transcripts by his own lawyers, Mercer realized with a jolt of horror that he had just committed another federal felony, obstruction of justice. His powerful friends, smelling the stench of political death, abandoned him immediately. Day 12. The dominoes continued to fall. The police union, which had initially issued a defiant statement defending Officer Russo, fell silent after the body camera footage was leaked to the press. The property management company that employed Carl Miller terminated his contract and announced a complete overhaul of their hiring and training practices. Julian Mercer's business partners, seeing the mountain of evidence against him, began cutting deals with the U.S. Attorney's Office, agreeing to testify against him in exchange for leniency. Throughout this cascading collapse, Elias Vance remained the calm, quiet center of the storm. He coordinated the dual investigations with methodical precision, his focus never wavering. He wasn't driven by revenge. He was driven by a commitment to a process. He had set the dominoes in motion, and now he was simply watching them fall, each one triggering the next in an unstoppable chain reaction of accountability that he had personally engineered. 3 weeks after the raid, the 15th floor conference room of the Apex Center had been transformed. Where once Julian Mercer had held board meetings, there now stood a long table surrounded by the key players in his downfall. It was a scene orchestrated by Elias Vance, a demonstration of power and a formal presentation of the case he had built. At the head of the table sat Elias, composed and authoritative. To his left sat the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of North Carolina. To his right, the lead attorney from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, flown in from Washington, D.C. Seated before them were Julian Mercer and his shell-shocked legal team. The deputy chief of the Charlotte Police Department, his face grim, and a senior executive from the real estate trust that owned the building. Carl Miller and Officer Russo were not present. They were considered subjects of a criminal investigation, not parties to a negotiation. For the sake of clarity, I will begin by formally introducing myself. Elias's voice filled the room, quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. I'm Special Agent in Charge Elias Vance. I am a 15-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have led investigations resulting in more than 100 federal convictions for financial crimes, public corruption, and civil rights violations. He paused, letting the weight of his resume settle. He then tapped a key on his laptop, and a large display screen on the wall lit up, showing not legal documents, but his official FBI credentials, a list of his commendations, and his letter of appointment signed by the director of the FBI. My position grants me direct operational authority from the director of the FBI and the leadership of the Department of Justice, he continued, his tone factual and devoid of ego. I am authorized to pursue all relevant lines of investigation, including, and especially, those that emerge unexpectedly during the course of a primary operation. He advanced the slide. A new display appeared, this one showing a detailed statistical analysis. Mr. Miller, your now former security director, he said, addressing the executive from the real estate trust, has filed exactly 17 suspicious individual reports with local police in the past 12 months. All 17 of those individuals were people of color. All 17 were found to be legitimate visitors, tenants, or workers in this building. None resulted in a single criminal charge. The executive's face went pale. This established pattern, Elias explained, his voice like a scalpel, provided the predicate for our dual investigation. The frequency and consistency of these incidents raised concerns that went far beyond isolated poor judgment and pointed toward a systemic, de facto policy of racial profiling. He then turned his attention to the deputy police chief, and the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department responded to every single one of those 17 calls. Our analysis of the dispatch logs and officer reports shows a consistent pattern of escalation in cases involving minority subjects, as compared to similar calls involving white subjects. The deputy chief shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Agent Vance, I want to assure you, the department is taking these allegations with the utmost seriousness. I'm certain you are taking them seriously now, Elias cut in, his voice hardening slightly. However, the pattern suggests systemic issues that will require far more than assurances. They will require federal oversight. He clicked to the final, most damning slide. It was a complex diagram, a web of connections showing financial transactions, phone calls, and security protocols. Which brings me to you, Mr. Mercer, Elias said, his gaze locking onto the disgraced CO. For years, you have operated a massive criminal enterprise from within the very heart of this city's financial district, and you have done so with a sense of impunity. We believe we now understand why. He used a laser pointer to trace a line on the diagram, connecting Mercer's financial operations to the building's security policies. Our thesis, which is now the central pillar of our prosecution, is that these two crimes were not concurrent. They were symbiotic. The possibility that a discriminatory and hostile security environment was deliberately fostered and encouraged is now an active and primary angle of our investigation. You, Mr. Mercer, benefited from a security force that was so busy harassing black professionals that they failed to notice the fleet of armored cars picking up illicit cash from your offices twice a week. Your security policy wasn't just biased, it was a smokescreen, a shield of prejudice to protect a core of corruption. The room was utterly silent. Mercer's lawyer began to scribble furiously on his legal pad, but Mercer himself just stared, his face a mask of disbelief. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and utterly dismantled. Elias Vance stood up, his presence dominating the room. He was no longer just the agent who had been wronged. He was the architect of their destruction, the man who had seen the deeper, uglier truth connecting their individual sins. He had not come here seeking an apology for himself. He had come to deliver an indictment against an entire system, and he had brought the full weight of the United States government with him to back it up. The wheels of federal justice, once set in motion by Elias, ground forward with inexorable force. The subsequent months were not a single, dramatic trial, but a series of methodical, interlocking legal proceedings, each one building on the last. The first to fall was Julia Mercer. In the main federal courtroom in Charlotte, Elias Vance took the stand. Dressed in a conservative dark suit, he was the picture of calm, professional competence. He spoke with precise clarity, his testimony a devastating narrative built on a mountain of irrefutable documentation. He walked the jury through the labyrinth of shell corporations, the falsified financial statements, and the wire transfers that siphoned over $100 million from pension funds, charities, and individual investors. These were not administrative errors or market downturns, Elias explained, as the prosecutor displayed a complex flowchart of the money laundering operation on the courtroom screens. This was a deliberate, systematic, 7-year campaign of fraud. Mr. Mercer created an elaborate architecture of deceit specifically designed to conceal criminal activity and enrich himself at the expense of thousands of victims. Mercer's high-priced legal team attempted to paint him as a brilliant but detached visionary who was unaware of the day-to-day actions of his subordinates. Elias dismantled this defense with cold, hard evidence. Emails, signed documents, and recorded phone calls that proved Mercer was not just aware of the fraud, but was its chief architect. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict him on all counts. The judge, citing the magnitude of the crimes and the defendant's complete lack of remorse, sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As federal marshals led him away, Mercer shot a look of pure hatred at Elias, who met his gaze with the same detached focus he had shown throughout the investigation. Across town, in a sterile administrative hearing room, Officer Russo faced the police department's internal review board. The female officer who had stepped forward to support Elias provided damning testimony, not just about the incident at the Apex Center, but about a dozen other encounters she had witnessed where Russo had needlessly escalated situations involving minority citizens. Her testimony opened the floodgates. Other officers, emboldened by her courage and the federal oversight now looming over the department, came forward with their own stories. The board, presented with a documented pattern of misconduct corroborated by multiple sources and Russo's own body camera footage, voted unanimously for his immediate termination. The U.S. Attorney's Office, using this finding, then proceeded with a criminal indictment for deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Russo, facing prison time, accepted a plea bargain that barred him from ever working in law enforcement again. Carl Miller's fate was decided not in a courtroom, but in a series of civil depositions. Faced with a class action lawsuit from the 17 individuals he had falsely reported, and with the irrefutable evidence from the building's own security footage, his former employer's insurance company settled for a substantial sum. The terms of the settlement, made public, required Miller to issue a formal apology and attend mandatory anti-bias training. He became unemployable in the security industry, a pariah whose name was synonymous with the very prejudice the industry was now being forced to confront. Elias attended each of these key proceedings. He provided testimony when required, but mostly he observed. He watched as the systems of accountability he had activated did their work. His presence in the back of the courtroom or the hearing room was a silent, powerful reminder of how this all began. A reminder of the consequences of underestimating a man based on the color of his skin. The final act was the signing of a consent decree between the Department of Justice and the city of Charlotte. The police department was placed under federal monitoring, committing to comprehensive retraining, new use of force policies, and the implementation of an early warning system to identify officers with patterns of biased behavior. The case of United States versus Mercer et al. Became a landmark, not just for the financial crimes it prosecuted, but for the legal precedent it set in formally linking discriminatory practices to the facilitation of other federal crimes. Justice, in this case, was not just about punishment for individuals. It was about the forced reformation of the institutions that had enabled them. 6 months after the convictions, Elias Vance stood before the graduating class of the FBI National Academy at Quantico. The auditorium was filled with 200 of the nation's brightest and most ambitious new agents, their faces a mixture of eagerness and awe. Elias, in his crisp FBI uniform, commanded the room not with volume, but with the quiet, earned authority of a man who had been tested in the fires of both systemic corruption and personal prejudice. The Apex Center investigation, he began, his voice calm and resonant, exemplifies a truth we are only beginning to fully integrate into our operational doctrine. Seemingly separate forms of misconduct often reinforce each other. Financial crimes create the resources for influence and protection. Discriminatory practices provide a shield against legitimate scrutiny. Each makes the other possible. The cadets listened with rapt attention as he outlined how the dual investigation had become a catalyst for profound, industry-wide change. The real estate trust that owned the Apex Center, under the shadow of federal lawsuits, had implemented the court-mandated reforms with a vengeance. They didn't just meet the minimum compliance. They established a comprehensive, data-driven bias training program that was now being adopted by property management firms across the country. Security personnel now underwent quarterly assessments of their interaction patterns, with anonymized data tracking the demographics of security stops. Any statistical disparity automatically triggered an internal investigation. Measurable accountability creates measurable change, Elias stated, a slide appearing behind him showing a 76% decrease in discriminatory security interactions across properties that had adopted these new protocols. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, he explained, was undergoing an even more profound transformation under the federal consent decree. They had replaced reactive discipline with proactive monitoring. Body camera footage was now subjected to regular, randomized algorithmic review to identify potential bias patterns before they became entrenched behaviors. And a female officer who had testified against Russo, she now headed a newly established professional standards unit with direct reporting authority to the city's new police chief. Her courage in addressing an internal problem prevented a complete federal receivership, Elias told the cadets. Their reforms, born of crisis, now serve as a model for departments nationwide who wish to build trust and legitimacy. Inspired by Elias's work, the FBI itself had established a permanent civil rights compliance unit, specifically focused on investigating systemic patterns rather than isolated incidents. The secondary protocol he had initiated was now a formal, though still classified, part of agent training. The ripple effects extended into the private sector. Professional organizations representing building security firms developed new anti-discrimination certification standards. Insurance companies, recognizing the massive liability posed by biased practices, began offering significant rate reductions for certified companies. The financial incentive accelerated reform faster than any law could have. Elias rarely spoke of the personal dimension of the case. When offered a promotion to a high-level administrative position at FBI headquarters, he had politely declined, choosing to remain in the field where he could directly mentor new agents. He believed the work was on the ground, not in a corner office in Washington. Systemic problems, he told a congressional committee reviewing civil rights enforcement months later, require systemic solutions. When institutions begin to measure what truly matters, fairness, equal access, and unbiased conduct, and hold themselves accountable to those metrics, transformation follows. The most profound impact of the Apex case, however, remained largely invisible. It was in the confrontations that now never happened. The careers of black professionals that were no longer impeded by baseless suspicion. The talent that wasn't lost to discriminatory barriers. It was progress measured not by what occurred, but by what no longer needed to be endured. Justice, Elias had come to believe, wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. True accountability doesn't just penalize. It creates lasting, systemic change. This had become his defining philosophy. If this story resonated with you, and you believe in the power of strategic patience and systemic accountability, then you're going to love what's coming next on our channel. We bring you true accounts of justice served and strategic empowerment in professional settings. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss our weekly stories of authority being challenged and accountability being delivered. These aren't just stories, they're masterclasses in strategic empowerment. Like this video, to help our algorithm push this story to more people who need to see how documentation and courage can transform personal discrimination into institutional change. Behind every headline, there is a human story. And in the comments below, we want to hear from you. What does true accountability look like to you in 2025? Please comment with respect for everyone's perspective and join the conversation.